Welcome. On behalf of CIA, I welcome you to today's webinar, State Drug Price Transparency Reporting, a holistic approach to maintain compliance and operational readiness. Our webinar today is hosted by Citius Tech. Questions and answers will be taken after today's presentation. To submit your question at any time, please use the question and answer box located on the toolbar of your Zoom window. Within a few days, you will receive a post-webinar email containing the presentation slides, recording of today's presentation, and a link to complete an evaluation. Should you have any further questions, you may submit these at the end of the evaluation. Today's presenters include Tim Litton, Director of Pricing Transparency at Fluid Edge Consulting. We also have Rajat Chukla, Senior Life Sciences Consultant from Citius Tech. Tim has been leading the state drug price transparency capacity at Fluid Edge Consulting. He has 20+ years of experience. Rajat leads the Life Sciences Consulting practice at Citius Tech, and he's actively involved in developing products and solutions for life science clients. He has 16+ years of experience in the pharma industry. At this time, I would like to hand it over to our first presenter, Tim. Tim, take it away.
Great, thanks, Brittany. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. As we get started here, just a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions that Rajat and I expressed during this presentation are from us and not related to DIA at all. So just to set that up. Now, as we get started here, the first thing we wanted to do was really understand who was on the call. So we're going to have a quick polling question for everybody to respond to. And that is, what level of expertise do you have in state price transparency reporting from an organizational perspective? So if you can take a second and go ahead and vote, and that will give us an idea of the, what kind of, what range we have of people on the call in this area. All right, wow, a lot of new people there. Excellent, excellent. So, okay, that is great. Now, one of the things, I'm going to go to the objectives here. The different types of, so what we plan to cover today are the different types of the laws and their complexities. Now, given the fact that there are so many laws, there are so many different variations within the laws, we're not going to be able to cover law by law, but more of a general overview of each of the different areas to give you that perspective. We're going to talk about operational considerations and ensuring compliance. So as all these laws are coming up, it's really difficult to track and maintain. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then lastly, we're going to talk about an approach to optimize and manage the reporting process. How do you get all this under control? How do you manage it? How do you make sure that your organization's compliant? How do you make sure your leadership is in the loop in some of these things that are becoming more and more transparent across the nation with all the different states passing laws? So our agenda for this morning is I'm going to go through an overview, talk about some of the laws. Then we're going to talk about the type of reporting requirements and the associated complexities of those. And that with a lot of new people on the line that have not been working in this space for a while, hopefully this will be a very, informative area for you to get a picture of everything that's going on in the area. Then we'll talk about the operational considerations and how do you build this capability. And then finally, we'll talk about the recommended approach to manage the reporting process. So what do you need to be aware of as manufacturers? Right now, there's been at least 14 states that have enacted legislation in an attempt to curb drug prices, right? So it's growing. It's at 14 now. Some have been on the books for a while. The last couple of years, quite a few states have passed more, and we expect that trend to continue, right? And there's the potential for the federal government to also do something in this space as well. Knowing it's an election year coming up, we anticipate that there are going to be, this is going to be a hot topic for debate in the election cycle. There is little consistency across the data elements, the formats, and the timing required across the states. So there may be multiple states that have the same type of law. So let's talk about product launches or new products. While they're similar, they're not the same. And you need to be able to understand the differences between the two, each state, what they're looking for, what they're not looking for, in order to be compliant in making sure that you as an organization are not submitting information that you shouldn't be submitting to a state if you don't have to. It's very critical to understand, again, what is required, the timelines, the level of data, protection, that's a big one, and potential penalties, because there is an potential to be fined by these states for not complying with these laws. Again, timelines will vary. We'll go over a couple examples of that for both product launches and price increases. Some of the data elements that they're asking for may not exist, or they're not easily obtainable. They're asking for information at the NDC level rather than at the brand level. And even some of the information that they're asking for may not be available, within your finance systems. You may not go down to that level of detail for what they're asking for. So those are some of the things that you need to consider and build a strategy internally on in order to address. You also need to be aware that some of the states will publish these reports into the public domain. So as you're submitting or preparing and submitting these reports, you need to be very careful of what you're putting in there, where you're asking for data protection, because at certain points in time, the states have basically said, we will make this information public and we will post it on our website, which they have already started to do. There are penalties for non-compliance. So if you don't meet an obligation and the state finds out, they will fine you, and then you have to work through with each of the individual states on that. And we've already seen substantial penalties in this area. So the state of Nevada, for instance, published the fines that they had levied across some of the manufacturers online, and some of them were quite substantial. So you don't want to end up in that spot where you're having to respond and pay fees and penalties for non-compliance of some of these laws. These laws apply to all manufacturers. So one of the things that I've heard in my experience is that some of the smaller organizations that are just may not even have a commercial product on the market yet. They may have 2 or 3 products in their pipeline that they're working towards approvals and launching for, and kind of the mindset has been, these laws don't apply to us, it applies to big pharma, but in actuality, it applies to everybody. So all manufacturers need to be aware of these laws. Okay, let's get into some of the reporting requirements and some of the complexities around them, right? So what triggers a report? FDA approvals and product launches, again, within the scope of meeting the defined criteria, which is different state to state. Price increase, which define thresholds. So again, there's multiple states that have price increase legislation that is either for the current year, past 2 years, past 3 years. If you meet a certain threshold, you need to report that information. Some of them you need to report that in advance of taking the price increase. So not only do you need to, which moves the whole timeline cycle up within your organization of, we're looking to take price increases, you have to understand that there is a, for instance, in California, a 60-day lead notification, so that you notify the purchasers within the state of California 60 days prior to taking that price increase. So you need to build that into your process, your internal process. There are identified product lists that are published by state. So for instance, Nevada is one that I'll just talk about briefly, but each year they will publish a essential diabetes report. This year they're moving it in adding asthma to that. But basically, if you're on that report, you need to respond to them by April 1st with the report. So the state will basically dictate, we want to know what's, information behind these products. And then there's additional things that are out there. So some states are asking manufacturers to register so that they have that information and can have those open lines and do the reporting off of that. You have WAC wholesale acquisition cost reports. Some of them, like Louisiana, have been in effect for quite a while, but now there are new ones. For instance, Texas is new this year. You have to do a very similar report for them, but they're looking to have the WAC price reported to them for all of your NDCs. And then there is the physician disclosures. So prescribing physicians in Vermont and Colorado, you have to, if it meets the certain criteria, you need to let them know certain information around those products. Let's dive into this a little bit deeper, and let's talk about FDA approvals and product launches. Currently, there's 6 states. You see them there: California, Connecticut, Maine, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. You'll see throughout the presentation that Washington has the little footnote there. Although they passed their laws effective in October of 2019, the state has taken a year to basically say we need to get our infrastructure together, make sure we're collecting the right information, build our systems around that. So therefore, even though the laws went into effect, they've actually postponed them until October of this year. So you'll see that throughout the presentation. Defining a product launch is somewhat vague, right? So it's very clear for NDAs and BLAs. So those are new products that are coming to market, first time out. Those will need to be reported on if they meet the criteria. Most of the criteria in the states is if the 30-day supply exceeds the $670 Medicaid Part D specialty drug threshold. So that's kind of the primary, driver for needing to report them. But internally, you also need to talk about, well, if we have an abbreviated new drug application, an ANDA, does that qualify? New indications, extended releases, product combinations, generic products that you may manufacture, acquisition and licensing agreements. These are all things that need to be considered and talked about internally to know whether or not they need to be reported or not. And it's a lot of involvement with the legal teams, in some cases outside counsel, but making sure it's not just an NDA or BLA, but making sure that you're looking at the full scope so that you realize if you need to or don't need to report those products. The FDA approvals is something new that has just started here in January of 2020, which is, it's actually in Connecticut and Washington. And we'll have an example of that in a minute here, but essentially, as soon as your product is approved by the FDA, you need to report on it within a certain time period, which is different than a product launch, because your approval, just because you receive the approval, you may or may not launch that product, right, at that point in time. There may be manufacturing considerations or other timing. So your approval, you may get approved for a product today, but you're not planning to launch it until March 1st. The FDA approval time clock would start today, and then your product launch timeline would start on March 1st. So just again, you start to get all these different dates out there, and you need to be aware of them, what to do at which state, at which time. And we'll go through an example of that here in a minute. Again, the laws apply to all manufacturers. It's not just big pharma, it's anyone that's launching. And a lot of the companies that I've talked to and worked with don't have dedicated resources in this area, right? This is becoming a part-time job for some people, or teams that are being pulled together to manage this. So only a few companies that I'm aware of have actually built teams, around this to keep up with all the changes in this area. So from what's critical to understand the timelines for submissions, again, they vary across states. They do have different requirements. Some of the data that's being asked, again, doesn't exist, or it may be very sensitive information. And depending on the level of data protection, those are conversations you need to have internally with finance, legal, senior management around that information. Again, some states will publish this, so you need to be aware. You need to let people internally know that, hey, we filed a report in the state of Vermont for these new products, and in 6 months from now, that's going to appear on the Vermont website for anyone to see, that they'll have the WAC price and other information out in the public domain. Again, penalties, they vary by state, but if they find out that you haven't complied, they will levy penalties against you. And again, some of them have been very substantial. Let's get into an example here of the product launch reporting timeline. So for each product launched or approved, if you will, there are 8 submissions now, given the different states that are in there. So if you look on the far left, we have the FDA approval date, right? So that's the one where the FDA comes out and says, we approve your product to be, safe, and you can go and market it. In between there, somewhere is likely the product becomes commercially available. So again, in my earlier example, approved today, launched, the beginning of March, or it could be at the same time, right? So today it was approved, and we may be, have product in the pipeline or in the manufacturer, and we're ready to submit and get product into the channel, so we're actually launching it on the same day. However, the timelines, as you'll see here, so the first, 3 days after the product is commercially available, you have 2 notifications that are due to California and Vermont. So that, again, is based on the commercially available date, not the FDA approval date. 30 days after product is commercially available, you have reports due to Oregon and Washington, again, with Washington being later this year because it's been postponed. 33 days after, you have actual reports, not notifications. So day 3, you're notifying California and Vermont. Day 33, after a commercial launch, you are actually providing a much more detailed report to California and Vermont. And then you'll see on the far left that 60-day calendar notification for Washington and Connecticut is, again, based on the FDA approval date. So again, that 60-day report could be due before your product has been commercially launched. So that could slide around based on, those 2 dates, the approval date and when the product is commercially available. And there are 8 submissions for each one. Oh, and by the way, in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice that there is a little footnote there as well for the state of Maine. State of Maine basically says, each year we want you to tell us what you launched in the prior year. So, by the middle or end of January of 2021, they will want to have a report filed on all the products launched in 2020. So you have some that are due right at the time, 3 days, 33 days, 60 days, and then you need to keep track for Maine, everything that you launched during the year, so that you remember to report all of that information at the beginning of the following year. So again, this is where it gets real complex, and if you have multiple products launching in a similar time frame, you're talking 16, 24 different reports that are due, and their due dates could be overlapping in many different ways. So it gets to be quite a lot to manage internally. So that's product launch reporting. Let's talk a little bit about price increase reporting. Currently, 5 states, California, Maine, Oregon, Texas, and Washington. It's very complex, very different because the reporting thresholds for each state varies. They have different look-back periods. In some states, it's a rolling calendar year. In some states, it's current year. In other states, it's looking back up to 3 years. So they may have a 1-year threshold of, say, 15% and a 3-year threshold of price increases that go beyond 30%. And you need to take all of that into consideration. You may need to do advance notifications. Again, if you're planning to take an increase that's going to trigger in the state of California, you need to provide a 60-day advance notification before you take that increase so that you are compliant with the law. Most of them do have post notifications as well. So we took this increase, and here's information on these NDCs for these products that we took increases on. Timelines, again, vary. So kind of like what we saw in the product launches, it may be 30 days, it may be 30 days plus the end of the quarter that the increases were taken in. So it becomes very, you need to really stay on top of that and map everything out so you know when those reports are due. You are reporting at the NDC level for these reports. So it is an NDC by NDC level reporting. So again, a lot of information that they're asking for may or may not be available at that level and may need to be aggregated so that it can be reported on. Again, those are discussions internally with the legal department and the other commercial teams that need to be had. In some cases now they're looking, some of the states are looking for information, what was the WAC when you launched this product? So this product may have been on the market for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Well, they want to know what was the WAC then versus, what's the WAC going to be after you take this price increase? When's the patent expiration for this product? Which isn't always just a straightforward, oh, it's on, January 1st, 2021, because most products have multiple patents. So you need to, again, have those discussions internally to figure out what date needs to be reported in there, knowing that some of this information may end up in the public domain. Again, same as the product launches, the states will publish this information. It will be out on a website at some point. They do most of the states do have some level of data protection. What I've seen so far is that, they've honored that data protection that they've asked for. There's a lot of, within some of the states, nationally, reporters, local reporters, national reporters are basically filing public information requests to get at the confidential data so that they can report and disclose that. So far, everything that has, that you mark as trade secret and able to defend as being trade secret or confidential has been upheld, to my knowledge, which is great that the states are doing that. And again, if you don't file and the states find out, there are significant penalties across the states. So again, here's another timeline for price increases. And again, the thing here is it's a big timeline, right? So it's not just like, we're going to take the increases tomorrow and we'll do a report and be done with it. You have the 60-day notification in Washington before the price increases are taken. And then 30 days after the quarter, the reports are due. So let's put this into a real example. If you're going to take a price on, say, January 1st of 2020, you were planning, this is, before the end of the year last year. 1/1/2020, we plan to take a price increase and it qualifies for reporting. That means that the 60-day advance notifications would need to go out on November 1st, November 2nd timeframe, saying that these products are taking these increases, which by the end, may or may not actually be what is finally decided on, but you had to report it in order to take them. So those prices may have come down or been adjusted. But then on the back end of that, you have the report that's due 30 days after the end of the quarter of which those increases were taken. So since the price increases were taken on January 1st, that means that report would be due April 30th. So you're now looking at a reporting period that spans from November 1st or November 2nd all the way to April 30th, and you need to make sure that, just as importantly on the front end, you're doing that on the back end as well, okay? So again, there's just a lot of just trying to cover in the broad stroke here, the complexity, the different type of timelines that are out there. Here's a couple examples of the different calculations, just to show, the complexity between the two. So California has a 16% threshold that goes back over 2 years. And the way that their formula works is that the proposed WAC, which could be any time in 2020, it doesn't matter if it's January 1st or December 31st of 2020, you're going all the way back to January 1st of 2018. So 2 years of from the beginning. So if you were to take an increase in, say, December of 2020, it's almost really a 3-year look back that you're performing that calculation on. And if you meet that 16% increase, then that triggers the reporting process. Oregon, they have their annual report, which is a 10% threshold. It's based off of an annual or an average WAC. An average WAC. So you have to, throughout the year, take the WAC price. So if you were to take a price increase of in July 1st of 2019, you need to calculate the WAC for the first 6 months at price X, and for the second 6 months at price Y, and you need to average that together to get your average for the year, and then you're going to divide, use that against the prior year, and then determine whether or not that 10% threshold is met. So these are just 2 examples. There's many more. Some of the states, again, like Texas, will have a 1-year threshold of 15% and a 3-year look back of, say, 30% that you need to do. So you're not just looking at one state with one set of requirements. You're looking at multiple different scenarios across the states. Maine has like a 20% 1-year threshold. So they definitely vary, and these are things that you need to track and look at, and as you're making those commercial decisions around pricing, understand the implications of what those decisions are. All right, so moving on, identified products reports. Talked about this briefly in the beginning, but some of the states are basically saying, we'll tell you what we want you to report on. So again, for instance, the Nevada report here in, next week, Nevada will publish their report that says these are the products that we consider to be essential diabetes or essential asthma products that need to be reported on. And this report will be due on April 1st. So if you're on that report, you're obligated to respond and file a report by April 1st. New York Medicaid, you'll be notified if your product is on there, and they will come back and have negotiations with you related to Medicare. For Vermont net cost, annually they will publish a report that basically says an accumulation of the state and the key payers in the state. These are the most costly products, and they'll whittle that list down to the top 10 or 15. And if you're on that list, you need to respond to them with a report stating why your product is, the increase in cost to the state or to the payers has increased so much in that time period. And then there will be other states coming out that have a combination of PBM and payer high cost products reports that they'll be identifying within each state what are the products that are costing the most, and basically publishing those reports for manufacturers to respond to. And again, the requirements are different across each state. So again, knowing when these reports are going to be published, knowing what criteria that they're looking at, what data that they're looking at you submitting on as far as a response to the report. Those are all things that are coming up and you really need to be paying close attention to as you go through this process. Okay, on top of all of that, right, there's other requirements that manufacturers have as part of the state price transparency laws. Again, the registration, you need to register. In some states, you need to pay a fee for registering if you're registered. You have WAC reporting. The Louisiana WAC reporting has been going on for quite some time, but now, Texas has also added an annual report that'll be due here shortly. Physician price disclosures, Colorado and Vermont, that is, that law has been in effect since early in the 2000s, but this past year, Colorado passed a similar law where if you go in and detail a physician and you meet the criteria for disclosure, you need to, give that physician information related to that drug, the WAC, and the top generics in that class if they're available. And to complicate things even further, some of those states have portals, right, which are generally good, that you can go in and upload your information into the portal and it will edit the information that they're looking for. Some of the states, it's letters, or you create the report and you send it to them digitally. So it's not the same across the states, and to my knowledge, none of the portals are the same, across the different states. There's not like one vendor that's come up with a way to collect all this information, but you have to understand what the portal limitations are, what the validation rules behind the data are, so that when you have a report due today and you go to upload your data and they basically, the portal rejects it because it's not meeting the internal criteria. So those are even more things you need to be aware of as you're doing these reports. Okay, so let's move on to the operational considerations, and then we'll talk about the recommended approaches. So what are the kind of things that you should be thinking about as you look at all these different laws, all the obligations they're going both internally from a planning, brand planning or strategic planning perspective, as well as externally to the states that you need to be reporting about. You need to develop processes and procedures, right? You need to make sure that the reports that you're sending in, that they are accurate, that they're timely. You don't want to get fined. You don't want to end up in that space, but at the same time, you also need to make sure within your organization that you're not putting trade secret confidential information out into the public domain or to the states that don't have the public protection. So you need to have, those discussions. You need to communicate the laws internally within the organization. You need to educate people, senior leadership, brand leads. People need to be aware of what's going on in this environment, and especially given the fact that a lot of manufacturers have had to testify in front of Congress with their, basically here's what we do and how we do it. You need to make sure all that stuff is in sync as you're working within your organization. You really need to utilize tools and basically find a way to manage the timelines and submissions. So as you look back and think about the earlier slides related to the product launches and the FDA approvals and the price increase reporting, that's all going on as part of your business as usual work within the organization. And you need to start making sure that all those things are mapped out. You know when you should start working on a report, when do you need to start the review process, what data elements are key as far as having internal discussions on, related to the information, so that you can have everything approved, packaged, and ready to go by the time the report is due. A best practice is composing a cross-functional team to basically, make sure you're getting perspectives across the organization. finance, market access, legal, compliance, state government affairs. These are all areas that weigh in and should have a voice in, understanding and knowing what's being submitted within the organization, so that the information that you're putting forward has been looked at across the organization and not just within the team that you're working on. And then finally, with all this going on, right, most organizations are going to need resources to do this. The best way to do that is define metrics and measurements, right? Show the organization, the different types of how many submissions were made, what areas were they made in, were they timely, were they not timely, so that you can start to track this information over time, and you would have that information available if you needed it to go and have discussions with senior leadership. It's always a great idea to do metrics and measurements anyway, but that's the kind of thing that you can use that information for, in addition to, just keeping track of everything and making sure that things are submitted on time. All right, so that's kind of the overview and high-level, aspects of state law price transparency. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rajat to talk about the recommended approaches.
Sure, thanks, Tim. And just as we did at the start of the webinar, we would like to conduct a small poll as to assess the kind of preparedness that our audience have when it comes to meeting the state reg price transparency laws. So if you could take a moment to respond to this poll that you see on the screen. Okay, so that's a fair distribution. We have folks who are new to reporting, as well as people who have built reasonable amount of capability. So I believe the subsequent slides, which is where, can we move on to the next slide, Tim? The subsequent slides would...
sorry.
Yeah, these are... This is a recommended approach. We've seen that it is a complex landscape that is still evolving. It's just about 14 states that have enacted law so far, and there are more in the offing. So this is our effort to draft or recommend a suitable approach to get things under control, to tie all that we have discussed so far. But this slide depicts that if it were us, this is how we would approach designing a process to meet compliance requirements. By no means we suggest this to be the best or the only approach, but this is a summary of our experiences so far that we wanted to share. We believe that a structured approach like this can ensure one to manage and share information in a centralized manner, which is a fundamental requirement to ensure compliance in such a complex landscape, and to make sure that there are minimal chances of something slipping through the cracks. The idea is to ensure that you create a mechanism to evaluate regulatory implications, make sure that all relevant stakeholders are aware of the process, you get the right inputs, and there's adequate traceability maintained to support audits at any later stage. So what you see is a high-level overview of the proposed process. It begins by assessing your reporting requirements or the implications of the existing regulations. This can help understand how complex your reporting needs are and how complicated a process would you end up devising to meet your compliance needs. The next logical step is to define a process and to make sure it gets accepted across all relevant departments or the stakeholders. This is not just limited to defining responsibilities and reporting, but also to ensure that the scenarios for price increases are appropriately planned and a well-informed decision is taken across the organization. Getting the right people to manage this process and having appropriate tools to enable them comes in next. And finally, since the compliance needs are evolving, it is necessary to have a feedback and monitoring mechanism in place too. So let's take a quick look at each of these steps in detail. Next slide, please. So understanding the implications, we've seen that the threshold for reporting, the nature of information which is asked, and the reporting frequency, it all varies by state. Tim mentioned in his a few minutes ago that the requirements across states could be similar, but they are not the same, and there's a need to discern the differences between these, because that affects what you need to submit to a regulatory agency and what exactly is asked for. And there are questions of protecting your confidential information. Once you report it, how well is the information protected? What happens when it becomes public? Do you have safeguards available for protecting trade secrets? Can you submit a report under privilege? There are nuances as well. For instance, the need for reporting revenues and the interpretation of those rules. They vary by state as well. Some ask for margins, others ask for prices. And then, as Tim mentioned a few minutes ago, there might be some information requested that is not available yet. You need to make reasonable assumptions to report this info, and these assumptions need to be consistently followed for reporting across states. For instance, some states might ask, as part of your reporting obligations, to submit information on patent expiration dates. Now, each drug that is launched is protected by several patents, which very rarely expire concurrently. Now, which date and which patent do you choose to report, and why, is a standard which you need to consistently follow. Acquisition products, they present another challenge because the cost of acquiring these products is not always straightforward. Products that have been on the market for a long time, they are even trickier to estimate, especially the manufacturing cost. And then there is this question about who would be sharing the information that needs to be eventually reported. It can come from several departments like legal, finance, and pricing. Any assumptions or allocation standards which you make, they need to be agreed upon across these departments, and they need to be consistently followed for all future reporting. And then there is also need to be consistent in communicating the pricing strategy across the organization. For instance, in 2019, representatives from pharmaceutical manufacturers, they were invited to present to Congress their drug pricing practices. Now, this phase that we are talking about, where you assess implication of regulations, it can be a good status check. It can be a good instance where you can verify that the organizational practices that still reflect the same principles that the senior management has communicated or wants to follow. So this is a phase where you assess the implications, the impact on your product portfolio, the amount of reporting obligations that you might want to follow, and also start thinking about a process where you can make consistent assumptions or get consistent feedback from all the stakeholders. Which brings us to the next step, which is where you design an approach for design a process which can be followed consistently across the organization. This is where essentially you start creating a mechanism to bring everything together. You define a process for assessing implications to get the design inputs, create the right amount of traceability, and also to generate the broad acceptability of the process. People generally like to follow a process, especially for an area which is evolving as rapidly as pricing transparency. However, if they don't help create the process, or they are not clear about it, getting them to follow the process can become a challenge in itself. Therefore, as we discussed previously as well in Tim's session, it's best to discuss the regulatory implications with your cross-functional team to collaboratively come up with a process that's well understood and easy to follow, because it will not only help identify the reports that need to be submitted, it would also help avoid surprises. There have been instances where, for instance, organizations have submitted the initial report, but the follow-up, it fell through the cracks. You might need to submit an initial report 60 days in advance of a product launch, and then as we discussed, a follow-up could be required in the next 2 or 3 months, but a lot may change in this duration. People responsible for generating reports, they could change, roles can change, and in the absence of a process where you can keep a track of the follow-ups that need to be submitted, a follow-up report just might fall off the radar. A well-documented process with provisions to track status of each report, it can help avoid such scenarios. This process would also account for price increase scenarios and their impact on reporting obligations. Another important aspect to consider is an awareness about when a report becomes public. What information contained in it is something that your senior executives need to be aware of. Is it just the allocation models? Is it the pricing strategy? And Tim, you've worked on this a lot more than what I have, so if I could ask you to share your experience. What's the kind of information that senior executives need to be aware of, especially when it comes to creating a process where you want to have a feedback mechanism that, hey, this report is going to become public, and these are things that you need to consider.
Yeah, no, so in my experience, the senior executives being looped into this, it kind of varies by organization. Some of the smaller ones need to know, they're more involved and engaged across the process, just because they're a smaller organization. But for everybody, anytime that there's sensitive information, financial information being reported, I think it's a good idea that all the senior leadership understand that. I think they understand, like when a product launch, is going, like they know the product's launching, they know that they're reporting, but in some cases, the data becomes very sensitive and they need to be aware of that. They need to also, I think in some cases be aware of the process that the teams are using so that everyone is aligned to the process in the information that's being responded to. So typically it's definitely a best practice to keep the senior team in the loop on what's going on and what the states are asking for, when it's due, and then as a courtesy make sure that they they're aware of the bigger picture of when this information gets posted and becomes public.
Right. So once you've assessed, thanks Tim, by the way. So once you've assessed your implications and you've given a considerable thought into designing a process that makes the cross-functional team aware, puts in place mechanisms for assessing implications following those. The next step in our recommended approach, next slide please, yeah, is to assess whether you have got the right set of experts who are effectively managing this process, and what kind of tools would you need to enable them. Now, it's actually an old saying, but it still is true. People, processes, and tools in that order make a project successful. As important as having a sound process in place, it is equally important to have the right set of resources, the right set of experts managing them. Such experts who can make a process function smoothly, it greatly facilitates your efforts in being compliant. Now, these experts, they need to work with the information that's needed to generate reports. Generally speaking, most of this information is available in most organizations, maybe not exactly at the level that's needed, but it still exists. As we spoke previously, some of this information might need to be derived. But as long as you have a process to consistently derive that info, your resources can always follow it. This is where tools can be a huge enabler, especially in letting people manage the information better. It goes without saying that it's really important to have a capability to store all information centrally. Having a system in place which can, say, calculate your reporting obligations, remind you about the reports that are due, prompt you to submit them in time, and maybe have a workflow to approve those reports, at the bare minimum, can greatly facilitate these efforts. Now, this does not necessarily need to be a new system. You might have an existing project management system or a workflow system or a collaboration system, which is widely accepted, and it could also serve the purpose as long as it can be tailored to your requirements. We recommend taking a stock of the internal systems and assessing if those can be configured to meet your requirements before making investments in creating a new system. Large organizations with complex reporting needs might require custom interfaces or custom integrations, but at this stage, especially if you are starting or if you are embarking on this journey of ensuring compliance, what we have generally felt is that it makes a lot more sense to have a process using which you can have the information shared, rather than building in interfaces and integrations which automatically pull information from, let's say, your supply chain management system or your ERP system. As long as you have the basics right, you can always build on top of it. Remember, we're talking about tool as an enabler, not really as a solution in itself. And especially for organizations with a small product portfolio, having a complex system might not necessarily be needed. You may even have a project manager who could be dedicatedly following the processes, keeping an eye on your reporting obligations, making sure that they are interpreted correctly, and ensuring that the compliance requirements are met in a timely manner. So, in our opinion, tools, they definitely are enablers, especially those which assist your expert resources in keeping a track of your reporting obligations. But by no means are we recommending that a certain solution is the silver bullet for meeting all your compliance requirements. And next slide, please. So once you've put all these processes in place, you have staffed your resources and you have enabled them using the required tools. Remember, it's an evolving landscape, and this process has to be a living process, one that keeps an eye on the regulatory landscape and evolves with it. The feedback mechanism should also be such that you should be able to assess how effective the current processes and systems are. Periodic assessments would make it clear if there are ways to make the process more efficient or to improve it. Sometimes having user trainings on processes or having a system can make the overall process more efficient. Other times you might need to update the process itself to incorporate updates to regulations. So really what we're recommending is once you have gone through the grind of assessing applications, devising a process, maybe creating a standard operating process out of it, putting in place the right experts and the tools, make sure that there is a learning process. It evolves with time. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about a product concept that we've been working on. RxPC, it's a solution for facilitating drug pricing compliance. Some of the things that we considered while creating this concept was essentially to have a mechanism to make sure that all the relevant information is stored centrally, to make it easier for you to create reporting rules and to follow the planned timelines. We are planning to roll this out with the initial release with a summary of legislations, tracking capabilities, alerts and reminders, features to make sure that you're aware of upcoming commitments and deadlines. And some key use cases, which are on the next slide, that we are planning the solution to address. They include regulatory tracking, collaboration for generating reports, tracking submissions, real-time alerts, as well as to make sure that the system is audit-friendly and offers data security. I think those were all the thoughts that we wanted to share. So back to you, Brittany.
Yeah, so
Great,
just add
thank
something
you.
here real quick. And again, thanks, Rajat. This is, being able to track and have, the idea behind this tool is really have a way that the information's available to you without having to go to all the different states and to generate the different timelines that are needed to help assist in the complexities of the things that we saw earlier with the different timelines and dates and requirements for each state. So I just wanted to add that real quick. Sorry, Brittany.
That's okay. So it looks like we only have time for about one question. So with so many states and regulations, how does one keep track of things, especially when one is starting off in this process?
Great question, because there are so many states, there are so many different requirements. I mean, if I were new to this and coming in, I would go out and basically I would start documenting, get all the information and starting to build that repository. Outside of having a tool to do it for me, I would pull it in, categorize the different requirements, the different laws, the different states, the different data elements for each one that's being requested, whether or not the data is protected, not protected, will it be put in the public domain or not, and basically compile all of that information so that then I can start to develop a strategy around that internally and engaging the teams internally. But I think the first step is really about understanding how big of a pie this is, knowing that it's, what it is today is not what it's going to be tomorrow as new states come on and add additional legislation. You want to have, build that base of knowledge, understanding of what's being requested and when, in order to meet those obligations. And then as new states come on, you can continually add to that and update it and, draw parallels between states. This law in Vermont is very similar to this law in California, except for, these two pieces. Okay, that makes it a little bit easier to manage internally. So that would be what I would do.
Great, thank you. Rajat, do you have anything to add to that or no?
No, I think Bill eloquently summed it up. I mean, the first step is to make sure that one understands the legal implications clearly, and everything else flows from it. So, and the ability to know the kind of landscape that you're navigating, to interpret it clearly, is where I would start with it for me.
Great, thank you. And at this time, we thank you and hope you enjoy this online experience. Please be sure to visit the DIA website to view a complete listing of all educational offerings, as well as to register for upcoming webinars. Thank you to our presenters and also to you for joining today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.